Today we will explore a fascinating and rarely discussed question about the Middle Ages. What was, after all, the age of the men who marched to war in medieval armies? In this documentary, we will closely analyze the historical, archaeological, and documentary evidence that reveals who these combatants were, how they were recruited, trained, and, above all, at what age they faced the horrors of the battlefield. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. When we think of medieval soldiers, the imagination often evokes the figure of the shining knight, mounted on his warhorse, brandishing a longsword as he charges against the enemy under colorful banners. This image, while not entirely false, represents only a tiny fraction of the military reality of the Middle Ages. The truth is that the overwhelming majority of men who made up medieval armies were not noble knights, but peasants, freemen, artisans, serfs, and youths without any formal training. And many of them were extraordinarily young by the standards we know today. The question regarding the age of these soldiers leads us into a vast and complex territory, where the feudal system, obligations of vassalage, recruitment practices, archaeological discoveries on battlefields, and fragmentary records that have survived over centuries are intertwined. It is a journey that takes us from the royal courts of England to the frozen plains of Yorkshire, from the walls of Visby on the Swedish island of Gotland to the training grounds where 7-year-old boys took their first steps toward knighthood. To understand the age of medieval soldiers, one must first understand how the system that led them to war functioned. During most of the Middle Ages, there were no standing armies in the modern sense of the word. There were no barracks where professional soldiers awaited orders, nor military academies that trained officers according to a standardized curriculum. What existed was the feudal system, an intricate network of reciprocal obligations that linked kings to nobles, nobles to knights, and knights to serfs. In this system, land ownership was the central axis of everything. The king granted lands to his barons and earls in exchange for loyalty and, above all, military service. These nobles, in turn, distributed portions of their lands to knights and men-at-arms who were obliged to answer the call when war was announced. And at the base of this pyramid were the peasants and freemen who worked the land and who, in times of conflict, were summoned to swell the ranks of the army. In England, this system of summons was regulated by laws dating back to the Anglo-Saxon period. The Fyrd, as the Anglo-Saxon militia was known, was composed of freemen from each county, obliged to serve when the king so determined. The laws of Ine of Wessex, dating from the 690s, already imposed fines on different social classes that neglected military service. Over time, this system evolved. The Statute of Westminster of 1285, promulgated by Edward I, determined that all able-bodied men between 15 and 60 years of age should be ready to fight for the kingdom when the king deemed it necessary. This fact is revealing. 15 was the minimum legal age for military service in the late medieval England. On the European continent, feudal laws were similar. Peasants, freemen, burghers, and nobles between 15 and 60 years old could be summoned for military service when the king or the local lord required it, and they were expected to appear with weapons and armor compatible with their financial condition. But here a fundamental question arises. If the minimum age was 15, does that mean teenagers actually went to war? The answer, unfortunately, is yes, and they were not few. Military historians estimate that although the majority of soldiers in medieval armies were between 20 and 40 years old, up to a quarter of the forces could be composed of youths under 20, many of them only 15 or 16. This estimate is based on enlistment records, troop payment records, and increasingly on archaeological evidence obtained from the excavation of mass graves on ancient battlefields. It must be remembered that the concept of adolescence as we know it today simply did not exist in the Middle Ages. Medieval society did not recognize an intermediate stage between childhood and adulthood. A boy reached puberty, and from that moment on, he was considered a man. He could work, marry, take on responsibilities, and naturally wield a weapon. There were no birth certificates to be presented at the time of recruitment. There was no bureaucracy to verify the exact age of a young peasant summoned for the militia. When the local lord announced the need for men for war, The question was not how old the boy was, but whether he was capable of holding a spear, pulling a bow, or leveling a halberd. If the answer was yes, he marched. The situation was different for the sons of the nobility. For them, the path to war began long before the battlefield. The process of forming a medieval knight was long, rigorous, and began in early childhood. Around the age of 7, a boy from a noble family was sent to live in the house of another knight or baron, where he would serve as a page. In this role, the boy learned the rules of court etiquette, table manners, and the fundamentals of chivalrous life. But it was not just a courtly education. From an early age, the page began to familiarize himself with horses, hunting dogs, and simulated weapons. He trained with wooden swords and shields against other pages, learned to ride without hands, and to carry a lance. It was physical and mental preparation for what would come later. Around the age of 14, if his performance was satisfactory, the page was promoted to squire. The word squire comes from the Old French escuyer, which means shield-bearer. And that was exactly what the young man did. He carried his knight's shield, took care of his weapons and armor, saddled his horses and accompanied him in everything, including battle. But the role of the squire went far beyond that of a simple assistant. He trained with real weapons. He practiced fencing, archery, hand-to-hand combat, and simulated tournaments with a wooden target called a quintain. He studied the code of chivalry, learned heraldry, music, dance, and etiquette. It was a complete education, designed to transform a young noble into a capable warrior and a refined gentleman. This period of squireship typically lasted between 5 and 7 years. Around the age of 21, if the squire had demonstrated sufficient skill, courage, and loyalty, he could be dubbed a knight in a solemn ceremony known as an accolade. On the eve of the ceremony, the young man spent the entire night in a prayer vigil in a church or chapel. At dawn, he bathed ritually, dressed in white clothes symbolizing purity, and received his weapons and spurs from a noble or the king himself, who touched his shoulders with the blade of a sword and pronounced the words that declared him a knight. From that moment on, he was expected to live according to the ideals of chivalry, to defend the weak, protect the church, honor ladies, fight injustice, and face the enemy without ever retreating. But not all young nobles followed this orderly schedule. History is full of examples of teenagers who were thrown into the heat of battle long before completing their training. The most famous case is that of Edward, the Black Prince, son of Edward III of England. In 1346, at 16 years of age, Edward commanded the vanguard of the English army at the Battle of Crécy, one of the most important confrontations of the 100 Years' War. According to the chroniclers of the time, his father, the king, deliberately allowed the young prince to lead the battle, refusing to send reinforcements when the situation seemed unfavorable, so that he could prove his worth. Edward not only survived, but achieved a resounding victory against the French. His performance that day became legendary and helped consolidate the reputation of the English longbowman as the most devastating weapon on European battlefields. Another notable case is that of Henry, the future Henry V of England, who at 16 fought against Welsh rebels and was nearly killed in combat when an arrow hit his face during the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. The arrowhead penetrated several inches into his skull, and it took weeks of treatment by a royal surgeon to remove it. The young Henry survived, and years later became one of the most celebrated warrior kings in English history, leading the famous victory at Agincourt in 1415. And we cannot forget Joan of Arc, the young French peasant girl who, claiming divine visions, led French armies against the English during the 100 Years' War. The exact date of her birth is uncertain. Some historians point to 1412, others 1411 or 1414. What is known for certain is that she was still a teenager when she began her military career, probably at 17, and that she was only 19 or 20 when she was captured, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. What were these two young people, the Black Prince and Joan of Arc, doing fighting and leading in wars that seemed to have no chronological end? And more importantly, were they the exception or the rule? To answer this question, we need to look beyond written records and dive into the earth, literally, in search of answers that the bones of the dead can offer us. The archaeology of medieval battlefields is a relatively recent discipline, but one that has already produced extraordinary discoveries. One of the most revealing occurred in 1996 in the small village of Towton in North Yorkshire, in northern England. Construction workers performing renovations at Towton Hall, an old manorial estate, accidentally unearthed a mass grave containing human remains. Archaeologists from the University of Bradford and the West Yorkshire Archaeological Service were called to the site and, over the following years, meticulously excavated and documented what turned out to be one of the most significant archaeological finds in medieval military history. The remains belonged to soldiers who perished at the Battle of Towton, fought on Palm Sunday in 1461 during the Wars of the Roses. This battle was probably the largest and bloodiest confrontation ever fought on English soil. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 65,000 soldiers faced each other that day, in a muddy field covered in snow, between the villages of Towton and Saxton. The battle lasted about 10 hours and resulted in a decisive victory for the Yorkists, who secured the throne of England for Edward IV. The losses were catastrophic. Contemporary accounts speak of 28,000 dead, although modern historians consider these numbers exaggerated. The excavation of the Towton mass grave revealed the remains of at least 38 individuals, including 28 complete skeletons. Radiocarbon dating confirmed that the bones were contemporary to the battle. Osteological analysis revealed that all individuals were male, with ages ranging between 17 and 50 years. The majority, however, were between 24 and 30 years old. Many showed signs of healed injuries from previous combat, indicating they were veterans of other engagements. The youngest found in the grave was about 15 years old. The injuries recorded on the Towton skeletons are of a brutality that shocks even the most experienced researchers. 113 wounds were identified on the 28 recovered skulls, in addition to 43 postcranial lesions on the 38 bodies. Osteological analysis of the cranial wounds suggests that 73 were caused by sharp force trauma, 28 by blunt force trauma, and 12 by penetrating wounds. The weapons responsible for these injuries included swords, axes, maces, warhammers, and halberds, the preferred instruments of destruction for 15th century armies. One of the most notable skeletons in the Towton collection is known as Towton 25, named after the order in which it was removed from the pit. Towton 25 was a man between 36 and 45 years old at the time of his death, standing about 6 feet tall. Archaeologists believe he was of high social standing, possibly a mounted knight. His skeleton presents 8 distinct head wounds, a weapon cut deeply into his face, splitting the frontal bone of the skull in half. Another blade left a horizontal cut on the back of the skull. He also had a penetrating wound in his left foot, which shattered one of the bones and cut 2 others, suggesting that combatants on the ground were trying to hit him while he was mounted on his horse, or that this was a wound caused by a downward sword stroke. The remains of Towton 25 were reconstructed by researchers from the Towton Battlefield Archaeological Project and placed on display at the Richard III Experience in York. But Towton is not the only medieval battlefield that has surrendered its secrets to modern archaeology. Even more impressive in many respects is the case of the Battle of Visby, fought in 1361 on the island of Gotland, Sweden. That summer, King Valdemar IV of Denmark sent an army of 2,000 to 2,500 soldiers to invade Gotland, an island strategically located in the Baltic Sea that had prospered as a commercial center for the Hanseatic League. The Danish army was mainly composed of experienced Danish and German mercenaries, men hardened by years of conflict in the feudal wars of northern Europe. They wore what was known as transitional armor, with iron or steel plates over vital areas and joints over a full suit of chainmail. The defenders of Gotland were a completely different force. They were local militiamen, farmers, and small landowners, freemen with little or no actual combat experience. They armed themselves with whatever they had at hand: antiquated swords, spears, agricultural tools adapted for war, and outdated armor. Some wore chainmail or rudimentary platecoats to protect their torso. Others had only a helmet and a desperate hope to defend their land. When the two armies met before the walls of Visby on July 27, 1361, the result was a massacre. The Gotlandic militiamen, despite fighting for the survival of their families and their land, were simply no match for the professional Danish soldiers. About 1,800 defenders were killed in that final confrontation alone. After the devastating defeat, the citizens of Visby decided to surrender to avoid further losses. The dead were buried in mass graves near the city walls, and there they remained in peace for more than 5 centuries. Between 1905 and 1928, archaeologists excavated these graves and unearthed the remains of more than 1,185 individuals. What made these excavations particularly extraordinary was the fact that many of the bodies had been buried with their armor still on. The historian John Keegan explained that the summer heat and the enormous number of dead defeated the victors' efforts to strip them before decomposition began. This tragic circumstance offered archaeologists an unprecedented opportunity to study not only battle wounds, but also medieval armor and combat techniques. The osteological analysis of the Visby remains revealed a disturbing fact. At least 1/3 of the Gotlandic army was composed of miners and the elderly. Children and old men from Gotland's farming population had joined the defense of their island. The wounds on the skeletons were horrific. About 450 wounds were caused by cutting weapons, such as swords and axes, while about 120 were caused by piercing weapons, such as spears and arrows. Some skeletons showed 5, 6, or even 7 wounds from arrows or crossbow bolts. The collection of skeletons from Visby, now preserved at the Fornsalen Museum in Gotland and the Swedish History Museum in Stockholm, is the largest collection of battlefield skeletons in Europe and continues to be studied by anthropologists from around the world. The evidence from Towton and Visby, when combined with surviving documentary records, allows historians to draw a more accurate portrait of the typical medieval soldier. Excavations at St. Andrew's Cemetery, in the Fishergate area of York, although it was not a military cemetery per se, revealed 29 skeletons with fatal blade wounds. The average age of these individuals was 28, slightly older than the bodies found in military contexts from later periods. This data suggests that medieval soldiers may have been, on average, slightly older than their counterparts in the following centuries. But these averages do not tell the whole story. The age composition of a medieval army depended heavily on who was gathering it and for what purpose. The feudal armies of the early Middle Ages, based on obligations of vassalage, tended to be small and composed of trained warriors, the personal retinues of nobles and magnates. These men were professionals of war, or at least semi-professionals, and tended to be older and more experienced. When a baron marched to war, he took his best men with him, knights and men-at-arms who had trained for years and who knew the craft of destruction. On the other hand, when a king needed a larger army than his nobles could provide through the feudal system, he resorted to summoning militias, the so-called feudal levies. These levies recruited common men from villages and towns, peasants who normally spent their days ploughing fields and tending flocks. These men received minimal training, often no more than rudimentary instructions on how to hold a spear in formation. Their weapons were simple, often consisting of little more than a spear, a basic shield, and if they were lucky, a gambeson, a padded jacket that offered limited protection against cutting blows. In these levy armies, the age range was much wider, including men from 15 to 60 as determined by the laws of the time. The evolution of military recruitment throughout the Middle Ages is in itself a fascinating story. At the beginning of the medieval period, armies were essentially composed of magnates and their followers, relatively small bands of well-trained warriors. Logistics was a crucial limiting factor. Large armies were difficult to feed and move, and medieval kings simply did not have the administrative or financial resources to maintain large standing forces. An army of 5,000 warriors, counting servants and camp followers, already represented a force the size of the largest cities of the time, and its movement through the countryside was highly destructive to both friends and enemies. Over the centuries, however, the nature of war changed. Campaigns became longer, sieges more frequent, and conflicts more ambitious in scale. The 100 Years' War between England and France, which spanned from 1337 to 1453, perfectly exemplifies this transformation. The English armies that crossed the English Channel were typically composed of 7,000 to 10,000 professional soldiers, archers, and men-at-arms. They were relatively small forces by later standards, but composed of experienced and well-equipped combatants. Edward I of England, as early as the late 13th century, commanded armies that incorporated tens of thousands of paid archers and spearmen, recruited through a contractual system that gradually replaced old feudal obligations. This contractual system, based on written contracts called indentures, represented a revolution in medieval military recruitment. Instead of relying on feudal obligations, which were limited to 40 days of service per year and often disregarded, kings began to hire nobles and captains to recruit and lead companies of soldiers for set periods in exchange for payment. This system allowed for more professional and reliable armies, but it also opened the door to the employment of mercenaries, soldiers who fought exclusively for money and had no loyalty to any lord or cause beyond their own pocket. Mercenaries played a significant role in medieval warfare, especially from the 11th century onward. During the 100 Years' War, the English frequently hired companies of Gascons and Aquitanians, called routiers, to fight in France. In Italy, the condottieri offered their services to the highest bidder. In Switzerland, pikemen became the most feared mercenaries in Europe, known for their fierce discipline and surprising mobility. In Germany, the Landsknechts followed the Swiss model. The age of these professional soldiers varied, but they tended to be older and more experienced than forced recruit militiamen, simply because war was their trade and they either survived long enough to accumulate experience or died trying. Returning to the central question of age, it is important to consider what medieval life expectancy tells us about the context in which these soldiers lived. Life expectancy at birth in medieval Europe was shockingly low by modern standards, sitting between 25 and 35 years. But this number is deeply misleading. The low average is pulled down drastically by the very high infant mortality of the time. It is estimated that between 20 and 40% of children died before completing 5 years of age, victims of infectious diseases, malnutrition, and the countless ailments that medieval medicine was unable to treat. If a child survived childhood and early youth, their prospects improved considerably. Records of English landowners from the medieval period suggest that a man who reached 25 years of age could expect to live, on average, another 23 to 25 years, reaching an approximate age of 50. For the English nobility, the data shows that 50% of nobles died before age 50, with only 11% surpassing 70. This means that the typical medieval soldier lived in a world where death was a constant companion, not just on the battlefield, but in all aspects of daily life. Disease, workplace accidents, periodic famines, and, from 1347 onward, the apocalyptic devastation of the Black Death claimed lives at all ages. For women, childbirth was a mortal risk that eliminated many in the prime of their lives. For men, especially those of the noble class, war was the Great Reaper. The Wars of the Roses, for example, decimated entire generations of English noble families, eliminating firstborn sons who were meant to inherit lands and titles. In this context, the youth of medieval soldiers gains a different meaning. In a society where a 40-year-old man was already considered to be in advanced middle age, and where few reached 60, it is not surprising that young men of 15, 16, or 17 were considered perfectly fit for combat. Puberty, which in the Middle Ages probably occurred a bit later than today due to nutritional differences, marked the definitive transition between childhood and adulthood. From that moment on, the young man was expected to assume the responsibilities of a man, including that of fighting and, if necessary, dying. The so-called Children's Crusade of 1212 is often cited as an extreme example of the use of youth in medieval war, but more recent research demonstrates that this interpretation is largely mistaken. Despite the persistence of 19th century writers in glorifying or romanticizing this military expedition undertaken by poor children, modern scholars have argued that the Children's Crusade was not, in fact, an army of children, nor was it a crusade in the traditional sense. The Latin term pueri, used in the original sources, could mean both children and people of low social status, and most participants were likely composed of young adults and poor peasants, not children in the sense we understand today. Medieval infantry, the true mainstay of any army, deserves special attention when we discuss the question of age. While knights received years of specialized training, common infantrymen were often recruited in haste and received minimal training. In the 11th century, much of the infantry combat was conducted by lower-ranking nobles, middle-class freemen, and peasants who were expected to possess a minimum standard of equipment, usually including a helmet, spear, shield, and secondary weapons like an axe, long knife, or sword. Peasants were also employed as archers and skirmishers, providing missile cover for the heavy infantry and cavalry. The English longbowmen, who became the most feared weapon on European battlefields during the 100 Years' War, are a particularly interesting case. Training with the longbow began in youth, as years of practice were necessary to develop the muscular strength and precision needed to effectively use this devastating weapon. Skeletons of medieval archers often show characteristic bone deformities in the arms and shoulders, the result of years of repetitive effort pulling bows with a draw weight exceeding 100 pounds, 45 kilograms. These men began training as boys and became effective combatants in their teens, although their physical peak likely came a bit later, between their 20s and 30s. The crossbow, on the other hand, required much less training. Any reasonably strong man could learn to use it in weeks, making it ideal for arming inexperienced recruits, including youths who had never wielded a weapon. The Catholic Church tried to ban the crossbow at the Second Council of the Lateran in 1139, without success. The crossbow fired projectiles capable of piercing most medieval armor and had a range of 400 to 550 yards, 370 to 500 meters. Siege warfare, which became increasingly common throughout the Middle Ages, also required large numbers of men in the field for long periods. Besieging a castle or a fortified city was an operation that could last weeks or months, requiring not only combat soldiers, but also engineers, miners, carpenters, and a mass of manual laborers to build siege engines, dig trenches, and maintain supply lines. In these contexts, the age of the men involved was even more varied, as any pair of hands was useful, regardless of whether they belonged to a 15-year-old boy or a 50-year-old veteran. The Scandinavians of the High Middle Ages followed the general pattern of northern European armies, but with an even greater emphasis on infantry. The terrain of Scandinavia favored heavy infantry, and Scandinavian peasants formed a well-armed infantry, of which 30 to 50% would be archers or crossbowmen. The Scandinavian military levy system summoned men from a wide age range, and records suggest that young and old fought side by side. It is also valid to examine what happened to soldiers after the battle. Those who survived combat often carried the marks of war for the rest of their lives. Skeletons excavated from medieval battlefields show not only fatal wounds, but also healed fractures, worn joints, and signs of chronic diseases that would have made these men's lives a constant torment. Many of the Teuton skeletons, for example, showed healed injuries from previous combats, indicating they were veterans who had survived other engagements before meeting their end on that snowy Yorkshire field. The question of the age of medieval soldiers also invites us to reflect on the differences between the medieval soldier and the modern soldier. In contemporary professional armies, the minimum age for enlistment is generally 18, and soldiers receive months of intensive training before being sent into combat. Modern military careers follow formal progressions, with officers serving into their 40s, 50s, or 60s in senior command roles, while frontline combatants tend to be young adults. In the Middle Ages, this distinction between frontline combatants and command personnel was much less clear. Nobles and knights, regardless of age, led from the front, and the idea of a commander who remained in the rear while his men fought was generally viewed with contempt. The Statute of Winchester of 1285 and the Assizes of Arms of 1181 and 1252 in England reflect progressive attempts to regulate and organize military service, establishing which weapons and equipment each social class should possess and be ready to use when summoned. These laws implicitly recognized that the defense of the kingdom was the responsibility of all able-bodied men, regardless of their class or occupation. War was not a craft reserved for a professional elite. It was an obligation that could fall upon any man, from the humblest peasant to the most powerful earl. The transition from the feudal system to the contractual system of recruitment which occurred gradually throughout the 14th century, represented a fundamental change in the composition of medieval armies. The feudal system, with its limited and often reluctantly fulfilled obligations, gave way to a system based on contracts and payments, which allowed kings to gather larger and more professional forces. Edward III of England summoned the feudal host for the last time in a significant way in 1327. When the young Richard II gathered his vassals in 1385, this last summons of the feudal army was more an exercise in prestige, an act more political than military. This professionalization of armies had direct implications for the age of the soldiers. As war became an activity for paid professionals, the tendency was to recruit men between 20 and 35 years old, when the combination of physical vigor and experience was most favorable. Payment and enlistment records from the late English Middle Ages show many young soldiers and mercenaries, but also nobles and knights described as mature and experienced individuals, accompanied by their own retinues. Chroniclers of the time often describe archers and spearmen as locally recruited youths, while nobles and commanders are portrayed as mature and seasoned figures. The royal household, the elite professional corps of an English army, was composed of men of noble origin, coming from aristocratic families who wished to secure the king's favor or advance socially. These men tended to be older and more experienced. There were also nobles who came to fight on their own, paying their own expenses, driven by personal loyalty, the opportunity for glory, or political considerations. Foreign mercenaries served sporadically in English armies during the Middle Ages. During periods of civil war, they were often more loyal than native troops, and King John Lackland, relied heavily on them. Their use by unpopular kings to suppress resistance from nobles made mercenaries deeply loathed, and they were expelled from the country under the terms of the Magna Carta in 1215. But what does all this information tell us, taken together, about the age of medieval soldiers? The answer, as with so many historical questions, is that it depends. It depends on the period, the region, the type of army, the type of conflict, and the social class of the soldier in question. But some generalizations can be made with reasonable certainty. Most of the soldiers who made up medieval armies were between 20 and 40 years old. This was the age group that combined sufficient physical strength with some life experience and, ideally, some military training. Within this group, men between 20 and 30 years old likely formed the most numerous corps, especially among the infantry and archers. However, significant proportions of soldiers were younger. Up to a quarter of an army's strength could be composed of youths under 20, many of them only 15 or 16. These young men were more common among the militia levies than among professional troops, although even among knights there were notable cases of teenagers on the battlefield. At the other end of the spectrum, older men between 40 and 60 years old also served, especially in command roles or in emergency situations where the entire able-bodied male population was summoned. The archaeological evidence from the battlefields of Towton and Visby confirms this general picture, but also reveals details that written records do not capture. The skeletons show men who lived hard lives, with bodies marked by heavy labor, malnutrition, and injuries accumulated over years. They show men who died in terrible ways, with crushed skulls, severed limbs, and bones pierced by blades and arrowheads. And they show, in some cases, men who were little more than boys, thrown into a hell of steel and blood before they had the chance to fully experience life. The story of medieval soldiers is ultimately a story about the human condition in its most extreme expression. It is about young men torn from their villages and fields, armed with spears and prayers, and pushed to face armored knights and professional mercenaries. It is about noble boys trained from the age of 7 for the art of war, who by 16 were already leading armies and deciding the fate of kingdoms. It is about hardened veterans who survived one battle only to march toward the next, accumulating scars on body and soul until their luck finally ran out. And it is about modern archaeology, which allows us to look into the eyes of these people across the centuries, reading their stories in the bones they left behind. The battlefields of the Middle Ages still hold many secrets. Only a fraction of the known sites has been excavated, and the techniques of osteological and forensic analysis continue to evolve, offering new possibilities for understanding. Each unearthed skeleton is a silent testimony to a life lived and lost, an individual story that intertwines with the grand narrative of medieval military history. And each new discovery reminds us that, behind the shining armor and colorful banners, were human beings of flesh and bone, many of them too young for the horrors they were forced to face. The earth does not forget. In Yorkshire, in Gotland, in dozens of other battlefields scattered across Europe, the remains of medieval soldiers wait patiently for someone to find them and tell their stories. And when these bones are finally brought to light, they speak with an eloquence that no medieval chronicler could match. They speak of violence and courage, of wasted youth and involuntary sacrifice. They speak of a time when war was not a distant abstraction, but a brutal reality that could knock on the door of any family, in any village at any moment. And they speak above all of the fragility and resilience of human life, which even in the most terrible circumstances finds ways to persevere, to fight, and to be remembered. When we contemplate these remains, we are confronted with an uncomfortable truth. War has always claimed its highest price from the young. In the Middle Ages, as in all periods of history, it was the young men in the prime of their lives who wielded weapons, marched under banners, and fell on battlefields. Some were 15 years old, others were 50. Most were somewhere in the middle, young men who had barely begun to live when they were called to die. Their names, in most cases, have been lost forever, but their bones remain, and through them we can at least recognize their existence and honor their involuntary sacrifice. The Middle Ages bequeathed to us magnificent cathedrals, sublime works of art, legal systems that still influence our laws today, and a literature that continues to enchant us. But it also bequeathed to us blood-soaked battlefields and mass graves filled with young men who never had the chance to grow old. Understanding the age of medieval soldiers is not just an exercise in academic curiosity. It is an act of recognition and memory, a way of giving a face and an age to men whom history has reduced to numbers in a battle record or bones in a nameless pit. And it is perhaps a reminder that wars are always in their essence a waste of youth. If this narrative touched you and sparked your curiosity about the mysteries that history still holds, consider subscribing to this channel. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing stories that deserve to be told. Leave your comment below, share your reflections, and tell us what other themes you would like to explore with us. And if this documentary made you look at the past with new eyes, don't forget to leave your like so that more people can discover the silent voices echoing through the centuries, waiting patiently to be heard.